5 years have come and gone. The light of life still shines upon Eorzea. Man labors tirelessly to raise himself from the calamity's ruin. The realm is forever changed, a stranger to him once more. Yet heedless of what lies ahead, he shall press on. Spurred by the promise of peace and prosperity. Amid this period of great change, an adventurer arrives in Eorzea, one whose tale is yet unwritten.
Life of a Game, Final Fantasy XIV. Final Fantasy XIV was the second MMO developed by Square Enix, who was the father of the Final Fantasy franchise. Their first MMO most famously was Final Fantasy XI, which, despite it carrying the famous Final Fantasy name, had a rather niche existence. Still, it was a successful and long-running game. It featured a very unique style of play, with what some would call an overemphasis on group play. Final Fantasy XIV started its development as early as 2005. The main staff included multiple developers who had worked on previous entries in the Final Fantasy series. Producer Hiromochi Tanaka had acted as the original producer for Final Fantasy XI. Director Nobuaki Komoto was a director for 11 and had also been among the staff of Final Fantasy IX. Final Fantasy XIV was announced publicly on 2009. It launched later on September 30th, 2010. Unlike the other games I have covered on this channel though, the game was almost nearly universally disliked, struggling to garner even above a 49 out of 100 on Metacritic. Despite these bad reviews, the game 3 months after launch was still able to sell well over 500,000 copies. Likely in response to a poor launch, on December 2010, producer Hiromochi Tanaka and director Nobuaki Komoto were both removed from their posts. Tanaka took full responsibility for the game's failure, and the PS3 launch of Final Fantasy XIV was delayed indefinitely from its original March 2011 launch date. Square Enix said that they would not let it launch on that platform until the game had met their standards. The Final Fantasy XIV PC subscriptions were also cancelled indefinitely. Although Square Enix attempted to make consistent changes and updates to fixing their game, they came to the realization that they could not fully mend the game in its current state. This meant that if they wanted to save Final Fantasy XIV, they had to kill it. Servers were closed on November 11, 2012. Yoichi Wada, CEO of Square Enix at the time, believed that the failure of Final Fantasy XIV greatly damaged the Final Fantasy brand. Wada also stated that they planned on rebooting the Final Fantasy XIV MMO in an attempt to making the game what it should have been in the first place. Although some question why they should keep the same name and attempt a reboot, period, Square Enix stated that they believed relaunching it as a reboot would help win back previous fans and customers of the game. Failure was not something taken very lightly in Japanese culture. So our conclusion is that, well, this is probably the shortest history I have ever covered on a game or a company up until this point. But that's really because, well, there wasn't much history to cover with Final Fantasy XIV 1.0. It ran for 2 years or less and had a tumultuous development from the very beginning. Although it had some positive qualities to it, the game was mostly a failure. So why did the game fail so epically? Let's look at the largest contributing factors for the death of Final Fantasy XIV 1.0. The focus on graphics over gameplay, or substance. Square Enix outlined in their GDC presentation that one of the largest reasons Final Fantasy XIV 1.0 was such a dud was their overemphasis on graphics over things of substance, say gameplay or content. The graphics in 1.0 were incredible, better than the current iteration of Final Fantasy XIV. But as Square Enix learned the hard way, having a high graphical fidelity isn't always the most helpful when it comes to gamers of a broad audience. Not every gamer uses a high-end PC. WoW is such a popular game because it essentially runs on all machines. Meanwhile, Final Fantasy XIV 1.0 focused on having such strong graphical presentation and was barely even working on high-end PCs, period. I mean, its limiting engine and performance issues plagued even the most godly of PCs. Most famously, this issue took hold in the form of flower pots. Yes, flower pots were a fundamental reason that 1.0 failed. That's because these flower pots, and objects like them, took the same amount of polygons and shader lines that real character models took. When inanimate objects are hogging performance in a game that needs performance to show off the flashy graphics, well, you have a recipe for disaster. You can't have these sort of objects straining the server the same way players can. No one can deny that Final Fantasy XIV was a gorgeous game. But a gorgeous game with unfun gameplay, little to no content, and arbitrary restrictions on questing is bound to fail. In a Q&A Square Enix did near the end of Final Fantasy XIV 1.0's life, they were asked a question in regards to the game engine and performance. This is what they had to say. Currently, the game can only display 40 characters on screen no matter what kind of PC you have. However, with an MMO engine, people expect this to be dependent on hardware. A high PC should be able to display a large number of characters. That's why we're changing the graphics engine. So even if you did build that god PC, you still couldn't even run the game. I find the overemphasis on graphics to be sort of perplexing, especially for a game like Final Fantasy, and a game like an MMO that, well, is supposed to be displaying a lot of different characters on screen at the same time. So even if the graphics in Final Fantasy XIV were great, Square Enix would have crafted a car that looked like a Ferrari or Lamborghini, but ran like a T-model Ford. Final Fantasy as a franchise has always pushed the envelope when it comes to graphics. This is something we have all grown to love from them. But when graphics become more of a focus than having a fun and rewarding gameplay, it's not sound game design, especially in an MMO, which compared to most games requires an inordinate amount of time investment. But their focus on graphics wasn't the only problem with the game. It had a trickle-down effect that hurt other areas of the game as well. A simply incomplete and flawed project. I didn't just make this the only reason the game failed because I figured the focus on graphics was more of a failure in philosophy than execution. But Final Fantasy XIV 1.0 itself was just a deeply flawed project. This ultimately was why Square Enix had to trash it and start from scratch. When the game launched, the servers were crashing daily. This made the already poor performance even more terrible. But even if you could get past all of that, you still had a very bare-bone game that wasn't very fun. The game's combat system was painfully slow and frankly unintuitive. This combined with a very poor UI that was clearly designed for consoles over PC meant that even stomaching the basic gameplay of the game was excruciating. Crafting was a minigame, and the leveling system had a soft cap on it to where after 1 hour passed you could only level up half as fast as you would normally. What? Why would developers think it's a good idea to put a soft cap on leveling? Or the ability to take quests? I suspect the developers only put them there to put a leash on people's progression, because in-game in Final Fantasy XIV 1.0 was non-existent. Critics agreed that the game's graphics were good. They enjoyed Uematsu's score. Several critics praised the concepts behind jobs and leveling systems. In contrast to this though, unanimously criticism was laid against the gameplay pace, the convoluted interface, bugs, glitches, and the slow pace of the story. Most zones were the same tiles pasted over and over again, and there was little to no direction in the game. It had a fairly slow and weak story, so you were walking around not really knowing what you were supposed to do. It was a pseudo sandbox. The only reason people had to do anything was simply to exist in a Final Fantasy MMO universe, and, well, that's not really enough to maintain a healthy population. How could Square Enix make such terrible fumbles? Well, that's where the next reason comes to play. Out of touch with the market and its players. This is really a cardinal sin in gaming, period. But more so with MMOs, as they typically attract a much more hardcore crowd. When you have to shell over a monthly fee for a promise of future content and support, it's rather hard to do when the base game isn't even fun. Square Enix on record went on to say that one of the biggest reasons for being out of touch with the MMO market was their MMO Final Fantasy XI's consistent success. Yes, they blamed previous success on reasons for not having future success. But to be fair, it's not as bad as it might sound. They outlined that previous success can actually have a negative effect on developers. They could fall victim to succumbing to pressure, to succeeding a second time, stubbornly adhering to outdated policies, ignoring past successes while incorporating change for change's sake, and allowing past successes to foster a false sense of security. The heart of the issue Square Enix ran into was that they refused to listen to the community. Suits at Square Enix told Tanaka that they wanted something different than Final Fantasy XI. But perhaps they weren't clear enough in their direction, or perhaps, most importantly, they didn't ask the community what they actually wanted. This way they could know what aspects of Final Fantasy XI to keep, and which ones to discard for Final Fantasy XIV. Though some will say that the lack of direction is the fault of the previous director, Tanaka, who did take blame. This is something that the future director, Naoki Yoshida, also did criticize. Final Fantasy XIV didn't even have an official forum, so when closed and open beta testing was being conducted, they were supposed to collect the data from other forums. So a company that created a game that they already admitted to having ignored market standards for would now have to jump through hoops in order to get proper feedback from the gamers that they needed the feedback from. It was a pretty terrible situation they created, but it was one they ultimately paid the price of blood for. The open beta existed for a month and the game launched shortly after. Such a short testing phase and the poor ability to read and interpret user feedback is a clear reason that the game failed. This is why when the game launched, many of the issues people had already pointed out as being terrible, the level quest reliances and the restrictions on leveling, job system that was half finished, the slow combat, and the terrible performance, these issues were never fixed. This all seems very amateurish from Square Enix, but you have to give them some level of credit for openly admitting their issues. With feedback in particular, they created a forum and took feedback far more serious after their initial failures. This is what triggered them to ultimately understand that the game that they had created originally was far too limiting, and they were going to have to revise it, except they couldn't with the current engine. So they had to remake it, and thus that's how Final Fantasy A Realm Reborn was born. Final Fantasy XIV was dead to rights. The game was in shambles. They had to cancel subscriptions and people wouldn't even play the game when it was free. Square Enix was stubborn though. They refused to let the failure of the game define their company. This is why they ultimately chose to remake Final Fantasy XIV. They thought that this would be the most effective way in regaining the trust with their fanbase and showing that they could do better. Only just 1 year later, after the demise of Final Fantasy XIV, Square Enix was able to mount one of the most incredible comebacks in MMO and frankly gaming history. Final Fantasy XIV A Realm Reborn. Square Enix had a face full of mustard, but they were determined to rewrite their previous wrongs. Realizing previous direction was lacking, Square Enix knew that they had to find a new leader. Naoki Yoshida was put in charge as the lead director for the Square Enix team and their upcoming relaunch. Yoshida was previously known for his work on Bomberman 64 and the Dragon Quest franchise. August 27, 2013 saw the launch of the reborn Final Fantasy XIV, dubbed A Realm Reborn, or by its simpler name, Final Fantasy XIV 2.0. It released simultaneously on the PC and PS3 platforms, which was already a big improvement. Square Enix had already done far better than they had done previously, because they managed a simultaneous launch on 2 different platforms. If you remember, Final Fantasy XIV 1.0 wasn't even able to launch on PS3 period. Although things were looking up based on previous game tests, game sales, and advertising done for the game, when the game actually launched, it was met with server overloads. The amount of people buying and trying the game was overwhelming the Square Enix servers, and people were getting deja vu back to the Final Fantasy XIV 1.0 launch. Square literally had to halt purchasing of the game in order to combat the long wait times that were present. Naysayers were in abundance, and people saw this as the final straw for the already ill-fated Final Fantasy XIV game. Final Fantasy XIV's director Yoshida released a statement taking fault for the issues. He promised compensation. I would like to take the time to personally apologize once again to all those players who have been affected by the extended world login and character creation restrictions which have been in place for the past several days. These are a direct result of my inaccurate sales and login estimates, and as a producer, I must accept complete responsibility for this misstep. Each and every player who has been affected has my deepest apologies. Yoshida then offered a 7-day extension to the game's initial month-long trial period, and also allowed players to reactivate the title at a later date, absolutely free of charge. But as the game and the servers stabilized, Square Enix was finally able to show how much the game had improved and changed. Adding 2.0 to the title of the game wasn't indicative of how much really changed. But the name A Realm Reborn? It truly was a realm reborn. With Naoki Yoshida now at the helm, he took clear control over the game and its development, and was a very positive driving force for Square Enix and their relaunched Final Fantasy MMO. A Realm Reborn brought a number of large changes to the game. The first most obvious one being, well, it was less focused on graphics. This didn't mean that the game was necessarily ugly, it just wasn't nearly as exaggerated as it had been before. It focused more on the things that make Final Fantasy Final Fantasy. It had a story that carried you to the higher levels of the game. It was complete with voice acting, cutscenes, and a plethora of story missions. This meant that when players joined the game, they had a clear direction of where to go and weren't just dropped off in a wide-open, copy-pasted zone like in the original Final Fantasy 1.0. The UI was noticeably updated, and had more of a traditional MMO feel than the more outdated feel that Final Fantasy XI made famous. It was scalable by mouse click and had a sleeker look and finish to it. The combat became more streamlined, and it wasn't nearly as clunky as before, though some still scoffed at the idea of a 2-second GCD, or global cooldown. The job system, while I still believe to be a bit confusing, was greatly improved and simplified. A basic breakdown of this job system is probably not going to come across as basic, but bear with me. Credit to Crimson Samurai on the forums for this. Combat classes are Disciples of War and Disciples of Magic. The classes under War are Gladiator, Marauder, Lancer, Pugilist, and Archer. Under Magic, there is the Conjurer, Thaumaturge, and the Arcanist. Now, the jobs, think of them as like an upgrade to the class that you're currently playing, a kind of expansion, if you will. When a gladiator becomes a paladin, if you so choose, think you're still a gladiator, but you're also a paladin, you're a bit more. You become a job when you currently play the appropriate class and equip a soul crystal. For example, when you're playing a gladiator, you can equip a paladin soul crystal and you will become a paladin. The paladin has the same level progress as the gladiator, and any experience you gain as a paladin will essentially level the gladiator. It just gives you some extra specialization and abilities. Yoshida exclaimed to fans that they planned on introducing major patches every 3 months. 4 months after the launch of the game, Final Fantasy XIV had its first content patch titled A Realm Awoken. This launched 4 months later instead of the promised 3 months due to the possible launch issues. Though people didn't seem to mind about the delay as much, likely due to how communicated the dev team was with the community now. Major features of this patch included the addition of free company housing, the Wolves' Den PvP arena, and the Labyrinth of the Ancients, which was a 24-man raid. On schedule 3 months later, Square launched their Through the Maelstrom patch, which added more raid content as well as gardening and a few other cosmetic upgrades. July 8th, 2014, the Defenders of Eorzea content patch was launched. This patch introduced a large-scale PvP battlefield that fielded up to 72 players. This was noticeable as this marked the second patch since launch that added PvP content, which was something that Final Fantasy XI was severely lacking in.
The continental flats so that refugees may establish permanent settlements.
When last I looked, that was disputed territory.
Aye. Some might even call it a battlefield.
Maintaining their patch cycle, October 28, 2014 saw the launch of the Dreams of Ice patch, which came with more story raid content, but also introduced two new jobs, Rogue and Ninja.
Justice, warrior of light. I know who you are, and you know who I am.
The final content patch before the newest expansion was titled Before the Fall. This patch finished the storyline for A Realm Reborn as well as helped segue into the coming expansion Heavensward. It also introduced the Mandervale Gold Saucer, a theme park area devoted to the card game Triple Triad, Chocobo Racing, and other minigames. Prior to the launch of Heavensward, the game was nearing 4 million accounts, which meant that these users at least owned the game. It had a predicted active player base of over 1 million. According to IGN's reports on Square Enix's financials, Square Enix was doing better now than they had done business-wise in the past 2 to 3 years. The sales didn't necessarily change much, but if you looked at the net income, it shifted drastically from a loss of 5.7 billion yen in 2012 to a profit of 5.2 billion yen in 2013. It painted a pretty stark contrast with the company's extraordinary loss from last year, and Square Enix has now predicted profits of up to 6 billion yen by the end of the financial year on March 31st, 2014. This growth was exponential, especially if you take into account that this game was once considered dead only 1 to 2 years before. The first official expansion of Final Fantasy XIV was titled Heavensward. Not Heavensward, not Heaven's Ward, but Heavensward. It's supposed to be like if you're going a direction, right? If you're going upward, downward, Heavensward. Anyway, the expansion launched on June 23rd, 2015, which was only 2 years after the launch of Final Fantasy XIV, A Realm Reborn, and 5 years after the ill-fated Final Fantasy XIV 1.0. Critics raved about its story. This was really the first time in a Final Fantasy MMO that people thought the story was of the same or comparable quality that the fans were spoiled with other console Final Fantasy games. Though some would argue that the story in Heavensward was better than those games, they argued that mainly because it departed from the traditional Final Fantasy story and drew more from real themes such as racism and the questioning of religious dogma. In addition to the new areas and story, the expansion pack increased the level cap, added 3 new PvP modes, as well as adding 3 new character classes and a new playable race. And finally, the flagship of the expansion, if you will, is it introduced the flying gameplay through the use of airships and other airborne mounts. The expansion was received positively. Metacritic scored it as an 86. Though fans of the game weren't as lenient, they gave the expansion a 7.7 user rating, which was primarily due to later impressions to the game. Although the story was a clear upgrade, some people criticized that Yoshida made players who purchased the new expansion still go through the previous storyline present in Final Fantasy XIV A Realm Reborn. It was perplexing to some because the stories really weren't connected. Not to mention, when going back and playing A Realm Reborn, it felt dated in comparison. But although this video covers the success and rebirth of Final Fantasy XIV, it's not an MMO that is out of the woods yet in terms of its fate. Recent population numbers haven't been very impressive, mostly due to the changes to the raiding content in the game. Final Fantasy XIV A Realm Reborn at the end of the day is a theme park MMO. As you have learned if you watched my previous videos, theme park MMOs are heavily reliant on developer content in order to maintain a player base. Heavensward was meant to expand upon the content in the game, which was supposed to lead to a maintaining in player base or at least possible growth for Square Enix. However, after players finished the storyline, if they did, since it was hidden behind the being forced to beat a Realm Reborn story, if they weren't the PvE raiding crowd, those players seemed to leave soon after. Final Fantasy XIV's largest population was its raiders. This is reflected in the data that shows a loss of players after these poor mechanics were introduced. The raiders weren't very happy with the changes that Heavensward brought, as in a nutshell, Square Enix made the raiding content more accessible and by consequence easier for new players. This made some raids boring and removed what some would call medium difficulty content. It was either the normal modes, which were the equivalent of kill X amount of monsters and progress as a raid, or the very difficult Savage mode, which only the most hardcore players could actually play. Matters were made even worse when the way to obtain gear was heavily RNG based, and since progression moved at a slow and boring pace, it punished players who wanted to level up different jobs or make new characters. Something that had previously been a large staple of Final Fantasy XIV. One of the best things about Final Fantasy XIV was that you could essentially have one character and play a bunch of different types of classes and jobs and whatever else, or you could make a new one, maybe you wanted a different look. It didn't penalize you for doing that. Most players and critics compared the expansion to WoW's Cataclysm expansion, which many PvE players weren't fans of. Right before the launch of Heavensward, Final Fantasy XIV's active population, which is classified as you had to at least own a mount and be a subscribing player, was in the 800,000s. This is up from the 600,000 who were playing upon launch of A Realm Reborn. By looking at the chart on screen, you can see from the 2014-2016 window, this is what some people would call a natural ebb and flow of a population in an MMO. People naturally come and go, especially after completing story content and or raid content. After Heavensward was released, you saw what looked like a cyclical loss in players, but as January 2016 started, you had a significant drop in players leading up to the current active player base of 327,000 players, according to 2/9/2017. This is around half the players who played the game upon launch and around 1/3 of the players who were playing at the launch of Heavensward. It's clear that the changes brought with the Heavensward expansion were received mostly negatively, hence the loss in active players. Although hardcore raiders were certainly a vocal part of the community, they are by far the minority of the players. Less than 30,000 players beat the Savage content provided by Square Enix, which meant most of the remaining player base was subject to slogging through the boring and slow progression provided by the newest expansion. What's most telling looking at this data is that the raid participations between 3.0 and 3.3 significantly decreased, which doesn't bode well for Square Enix. With a new expansion on the way titled Stormblood set to release in the summer of 2017, Square Enix is still not out on their feet, and they might have a chance of recovering at least some of their population loss. Stormblood promises 2 new raids, 2 new jobs, one of them being famously known as the Red Mage archetype, as well as it adds the ability to traverse water. Square Enix announced 2 special guest creators were invited to assist with the design of the newly announced Alliance raid. Yasumi Matsuno, famous for Final Fantasy XII and Final Fantasy Tactics, will write the scenario surrounding the raid, while Kita, the last name that I have continued to butcher in this editing, famous for Omnimusha 2 and Shin Megami Tensei 4. He will spearhead the monster and boss design. Only time will tell whether or not Square Enix can keep its MMO afloat. Hopefully they can regain the large success they were experiencing with their launch of Final Fantasy up to their Heavensward expansion. So how was Square Enix able to relaunch a previously failed MMO and then go on to achieve great success? In the next part of this video, I will outline the largest contributing factors to the life of Final Fantasy XIV, A Realm Reborn. Naoki Yoshida, the man who saved Final Fantasy XIV. It's impossible to think of a more impactful member of the Final Fantasy XIV team than Naoki Yoshida. Although some might say, well, you have to thank the other employees. They are right to some extent. The reason Naoki is singled out for praise is the same reason he was singled out for criticism. Naoki made it a point to take the brunt of the community criticism, This was likely a reason for him being regarded rather positively by the community. If he is a lightning rod of sorts and takes all the punishment, then his team doesn't have to stomach or burden any of it. People don't hate people who fail. People hate people who fail and don't own up to their issues. Naoki Yoshida had experience developing and directing games, but had no prior experience with MMOs. This sort of makes his Herculean task to revive Final Fantasy XIV even that much more impressive, especially when he possessed an incredible ability to understand what the market wanted, while also having the peace of mind to add to the game the Final Fantasy franchise's signature feel.
まあちょっとやばいっす俺まずご挨拶前にですね、このアーリーアクセス3日間やってきましたけど、NA EU の TC の皆さんはちょっとメンテナンスが数回入ってしまってですね、貴重なアーリーアクセスのプレイの時間を多少ロストしてしまったので、今日この放送、全世界に放送されているので、まずその点お詫びさせてください。申し訳ありません。これから先長い、旅が始まるので、まあ、その中でまたその、あたりを挽回していけたらなと思ってます。ファイナルファンタジー14を、引き継ぐことになってもうすぐ3年になります。当初はそこまで、まあ、ゲームもね深く触れたわけでもなかったですし、まあなんとかできるだろうと、まあ、あとはやっぱり自分自身 FF が好きで、まあMMO が好きで。
It's easy to see firsthand how charismatic of a leader Naoki was. But charisma wasn't the only thing a good leader would need in bringing back a failed project from the dead. The arguably most important feature of said leader was a clear direction and willingness to make the tough decisions. Naoki made about 400 fundamental design decisions, which eliminated time lost to getting approvals, and also meant at the core, if something were to go wrong, he ultimately would be blamed for the failures. This is not something most people, or specifically game developers, are really willing to do. To accept that amount of weight on your shoulders is very risky, especially when, as previously shown by Square Enix, they have no issues getting rid of people who cannot be successful. Naoki at GDC 2014, Game Developers Conference, most famously likened running an MMORPG to running a country. He outlined if players dislike the game, they are going to want to migrate somewhere else, like a refugee would. If a company fails to respond to feedback, well then you have a dictatorship on your hands. Complaints are worth more than compliments because players who don't complain are far more likely to just leave. Developers of the game needed to be enthralled in their own game, otherwise they will lose touch with their audience. Square Enix took a risk with Naoki Yoshida. He was not somebody that was experienced in the world of MMOs. You could say that they trusted him with the future of the company, because when Final Fantasy XIV was performing badly, Square Enix was losing money. But when the game started to succeed, profits and business was soaring for Square Enix. What told Square Enix that Naoki was the right choice? We don't really know, but what we can say is that he was a supremely successful choice for the game and ultimately the company. Naoki Yoshida in an interview once stated that the most important attribute is not giving up. Never give up. A return to player feedback. One of the largest reasons for the failure of Final Fantasy XIV 1.0 was Square Enix not handling player feedback correctly. Not only did they not have a form for feedback to be collected on, when fans were testing the game in the closed beta phase, they outlined the clear issues the game had, but their voice was never really heard. This was possibly due to, as Square Enix pointed out in their PowerPoint at GDC, their inability or unwillingness to listen to new feedback. Especially because the previous product Final Fantasy XI was revolutionary in many ways, and was a game that was successful in breaking the common MMO mold. It's important to insulate yourself from bad feedback, but bad feedback isn't the same thing as negative feedback. Negative feedback can be instrumental in forming the foundation for a video game, or art period, when it's done constructively, of course. I'm looking at you, comments. Because fans of the game were distraught over repeated failures of 1.0, Naoki Yoshida had to restore trust in the player base. To address this, Yoshida began writing letters from the producer, which would discuss design direction, upcoming changes, player feedback, and increased transparency in the development process. Naoki and his team also worked on creating an official forums for Final Fantasy XIV. That way feedback could be more easily accessed and drawn upon when confronting tough design choices and changes. Yoshida was quoted saying that, "Throughout the different updates we were making for A Realm Reborn, we were gradually able to incorporate elements stemming from player feedback, as well as improvisations that weren't necessarily in our original designs. With their ears now open to the thoughts and plights of fans, Square Enix surely was able to transition this into making positive choices that affected the game positively. Though, hopefully they maintain this level of understanding, since most recently fans have been complaining in near unison concerning the raid content Heavensward presented to the game." Consistent updates and support. Consistent updates is something people grow to expect from MMOs, primarily because MMOs often charge monthly fees, which are a promise of future content and support, at least to some extent. However, if you watch my other videos and are familiar with the deaths of Warhammer and Global Agenda, then you know a primary issue MMOs have are a lack of content, or at least consistent content. When Naoki Yoshida took over development of Final Fantasy XIV, he vowed consistent updates to 1.0, as well as a parallel development of Final Fantasy XIV A Realm Reborn. This was certainly not an easy task. The idea behind it was that if they just abandoned Final Fantasy XIV 1.0, people would have seen it as a negative outcome. It was them giving up. Naoki and Square Enix believed that they needed to regain the trust, and the only way to do this was to both update the 1.0 title and work on creating the newer A Realm Reborn title. And this is why they had to adhere to very strict development plans. When Final Fantasy XIV A Realm Reborn launched, Square Enix promised that they would implement a major patch every 3 months. This would be in addition to the future content expansions, which were also promised rather early on. When they had to delay one of their patches due to launch issues, they issued a public apology and were very transparent with the community over issues. This was a breath of fresh air for most gamers, who had been used to the closed doors policies of most companies, where something goes wrong and you just don't really know what's going to happen. Square Enix made good on their promise for frequent updates, and they also launched a full-feature expansion with another on the way this summer. When fans lose faith in a company or game, they can be very slow to regain the loss of trust or interest. This is why Square Enix knew consistency and transparency of changes was the key to regaining these fans. It also would attract new fans. It's clear that they had to work extra hard in order to dig themselves out of this hole that they started in, but it's admirable to see the level of work and dedication they continued to put in their game, despite their very clear early failures. In conclusion, Final Fantasy XIV is a one-of-a-kind story. It's not very often you can see a company or game recover from certain death. But with persistence, a strong leader, and open ears to the community, Square Enix was able to resurrect the dying Final Fantasy XIV and establish it as one of the most popular MMOs of our age. So hopefully after watching this video, you guys have a better understanding of why the original launch of the game, Final Fantasy XIV 1.0, was a failure, and also understand why A Realm Reborn was ultimately successful. Towards the end of this video, I pointed out how the game is not really out of the woods yet in terms of its possible death, if you will. The game did lose its subscription numbers and is at an all-time low in terms of overall population. But hopefully and maybe Stormblood will bring them out of this rut. If you have a desire to see more videos like this or more of my Death of a Game videos, please subscribe to my channel. My social media links will be on the screen. If you guys want to join a Discord which allows you to have debates, talk about the videos, talk about the channels, you can meet other people, maybe discuss whatever the daily topic is or the weekly topic, and then also be able to meet other people that you can possibly play video games with. If you want to support me personally, then you can click on the Patreon link and donate as little as $1. I also wanted to do this video because I wanted to say thank you to Rode Microphones for sending me this microphone. I will turn it around so you guys can kind of see what it looks like. This is the NT1 USB microphone. Here's my little Rode pop shield that came with it. I talked to Rode first. They were the first company that I had requested anything from. I basically talked to them because I know of their products and I knew that I needed an upgrade in my microphone. I wanted to give you guys better quality and better sound quality, which means better content and which means a better viewing experience. So hopefully you guys have noticed the upgrade in my production, the upgrade in my sound, and hopefully you guys will enjoy this first of its series. Final Fantasy XIV will be the first game that I feature in Life of a Game. Now, if you guys want any details about this microphone in particular, you can just look in the description, or I'll have something on screen. I'm not one of those people who can like put it like on the screen exactly in some place, or at least I think that's kind of cheesy. So I'm just gonna like kind of do this like circular motion so it'll be somewhere around on the screen. But thanks for watching this video, guys, and as always, nerdSlayer